Good morning, everyone, and for our speaker, good evening. My name is John Eastman. I'm the 2021 visiting professor of conservative thought and policy at the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Welcome to our first lecture in our lecture series, Benson Center lecture series, aimed at the topic this year, community and disunity. I think a very important topic for us to be considering this year. Our speaker, to kick things off, is going to really lay a good foundation for us in classical political thought to serve as the touching off point for the entire lecture series. His name is Professor Hayden Auslund, and he's joining us today from Norway, where he is currently teaching at the University of Bergen in the Department of Philosophy. But he's a professor of classics, a longtime professor of classics at the University of Montana. I learned getting ready for his introduction today that he is also returning to the University of Colorado today. He did a stint back in 1988 as a visiting assistant professor of classics here at the University of Colorado. He's also taught at the University of Washington, Case Western Reserve as well. He has his undergraduate degree from Berkeley, his master's degree from Berkeley in Greek, and his PhD in classics from Berkeley. And I learned just recently that we actually overlapped. I studied classical Greek for one summer in an intensive course at Berkeley while he was there as a graduate student. He also has a master's degree from St. John's College in Santa Fe. And I want to give you a sense of who he is. This is from Rate My Professors. And here's a couple of good descriptions of his class. Love this professor and love this class. A lot of reading, but it is college after all. A class you can feel good about the grade you earn. Incredibly knowledgeable about all things Greek and Roman. Ditto to comment about high standards. Wish more profs had high standards. You will actually learn something from him. And so with that, let me introduce Professor Hayden Auslund. Hayden, welcome.
Thank you very much, John. I'm afraid I need to modify just two things you said. It is true I was at the University of Bergen visiting briefly about 5 years ago. I've had a long-term relationship with the people in philosophy there, though.
Sorry about that.
Keep it up still. And I taught in the philosophy department at University of Colorado, actually. Other gigs I've had have been in classics. Aside from that, I think you laid it out quite well. So thank you. Now I'm going to talk today about two people mainly, Aristotle and Cicero. And I want to lay the groundwork with a little bit of concrete history and then go through some things they say. And with any luck, try to end up in the United States of America in modern times. So let's see how much of that ground I can cover. As recorded Greek history begins in the 8th century BC, there emerged two characteristic forms of Greek settlement, which ancient historians call the ethnos and the polis. That first terminological thing could be shown now, Colin. For the Greeks, an ethnos was constituted by a common descent and culture, but was also distinguished by its lack of certain features essential to a polis. And ancient writers accordingly viewed the ethnos as the less well-developed of the two. Unlike an ethnos, a polis featured an urban center, a cluster of dwellings where common activities were centered, which had, with one exception that proves the rule, a defensive citadel. In fact, citadel seems to be the original meaning of the word polis. But unlike a modern city, a polis also had a dependent territory in which its members would farm. I say its members because in its developed meaning, a polis just was the persons constituting it. In historical terms then, a Greek polis was a multitude of human persons who had a defensible center of common activities with an outlying dependent territory. Now, Latinate English derivative words roughly corresponding to the two Greek terms for settlements convey some idea of their difference. To ethnos in Greek corresponds the Latin word natio, from which we get nation in English. Here we should think of the use of the word in reference to a tribal nation like the Sioux or the Cheyenne, and only derivatively of nation states like those of the French or Germans. The Romans had no term equivalent to the Greek polis, but could refer to a city either under its aspect as a cluster of dwellings, as in urbs, from which we get the adjective urban and urbane, or under its political aspect as a civitas, from which we get city, citizen, and other related terms. It is in reference to the Greek polis under its aspect as a civitas that Aristotle uses a phrase normally translated political community at the opening of his Politics, a work written sometime toward the end of the classical era, which Aristotle himself lived to see come to an end. And here I will be reading from a text that is in the Aristotle illustration. Since we see that every city is some sort of community and that every community is constituted for the sake of some good, where everyone does everything for the sake of what is held to be good, and it is clear that all communities aim at some good, and that the community that is most authoritative of all and embraces all the others does so particularly and aims at the most authoritative good of all. This is what is called the city, polis, or the political community. The Greek word Aristotle uses and translated community in the quoted passage is koinonia, an abstract noun derived from the adjective koinos, which approximates in meaning to the English common. It is used in Greek in opposition to another term, idios, which means something like private. An idiot is actually somebody that lives in a private world, you see. A rough equivalent is found in the Romans' opposition publicus versus privatus, from which we get our terms public and private. What Aristotle means with the generic term community can be gathered from several passages in which he uses the term in various connections, most notably in the final chapter of his discussion of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics. According to Aristotle, a community is a unified group of persons who are different in some way from each other, numbering at least two, but not too many, connected with one another by a common goal that they can achieve only together. To illustrate with one binary case, a marriage is a community of two different people formed with a view to a goal. And you look at Book of Common Prayer and you'll see what that is. And neither can realize without the other. Their union is what becomes the nucleus of a larger community, including additional persons, free and non-free, constituting a household. Analogous wholes of the village formed of a plurality of households, and a clan spread throughout a plurality of villages and other superordinate entities, tribes, phratries, and the like, until we have a polis, seemingly the most comprehensive kind of community. I say seemingly because in Roman and Christian times, the idea of a much larger kind of community became prominent. Aristotle distinguishes three grades of friendship according as the aim is pleasure, utility, or virtue. Of these, it seems that he regards a political community as corresponding to the second kind. But various strains in his greater argument suggest that ideally it reflects the other two as well. The community formed by friends in a way stands outside Aristotle's hierarchical political scheme, but in another way it also determines it. I'll try to explain how this can be. Political life was intensely competitive in an actual Greek polis, where one's friends were one's allies in political struggles with one's enemies. In fact, the original impetus for political philosophy was an impulse to improve on this perpetually antagonistic state of affairs. Aristotle's teacher Plato wrote a work on the problem entitled Politeia, often too loosely translated as Republic, in which his Socrates claims that such troubles will never end until, in one way or another, political power comes to be wielded by the lights of philosophical insight. How does he arrive at this idea? The work's argument begins by looking at transactional partnerships, moving to consider a tiny but agreeable polis based on a few members' mutual needs, which for certain reasons must then be built up into a far more elaborate polis informed by all the cardinal virtues. The characteristically Platonic question of the unity of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice in virtue as a whole takes the form of the problem of unifying the polis composed of differing classes. One image Socrates uses is of a musical attunement by which the differing strings of a lyre work together to produce a pleasing sound. The Greek word is harmonia, to which the Latin equivalent is concordia, from which we have our word concord. But to bring this about politically is easier said than done. A problem arises after Socrates claims that the ruling class, which embodies the virtue of wisdom, will have to include women on an equal footing with men. A problem that grows to unmanageable proportions when he adds that this class will feature a community of women and children, by which he means a thoroughgoing communism, not only of property, but of family life. When he is put on the spot about this, he takes refuge in an apparently irrelevant digression on war practices, at the conclusion of which the question of that ruling community's possibility reemerges is the question whether the polis they are constructing is possible. This is addressed with a claim about the need for unifying political power and wisdom that I mentioned. And the subject of a wholly communistic community of the guardian class is seemingly forgotten. The means to an informed rulership becomes instead an education initially including disciplines that were to become the quadrivium of medieval school curricula, that is to say, in the elements of a liberal education. It is left ambiguous how practicable the resulting political program is in a concrete sense. But we are left with the idea that a well-educated man can at least live in such a polis virtually, as it were. Now, this is where Aristotle's highest form of friendship becomes relevant. If, when surrounded with a hopelessly troubled political environment, one can take solace in an inner peace of some kind, there still arises a question whether there may not be other like-minded souls with whom one might form a community of friends. This had come about earlier with the followers of Pythagoras, one of whose sayings ran, quote, "The things of friends are in common," end quote. And it can be seen as foundational for later philosophical schools like Plato's own academy. One way in which to understand ancient political philosophy is as the effort to understand life in actual Greek polis, first in order, if at all possible, to bring politics more to resemble a community based on friendship, but then failing that, to be able to enjoy undisturbed smaller communities operating at a level of virtue above that of ordinary politics. Practical political efforts undertaken in southern Italy, first by Pythagoreans and later in another way by Plato, failed to success, something that Aristotle will have noticed. But the philosophical thought informing these attempts and incidentally resulting in what became what we still call the Academy influenced Aristotle's thinking as well as the tradition beyond. Now, Aristotle's work mysteriously disappeared a generation long after his death, reappearing only in the time of Cicero. I'm sorry, a generation not long after his death, reappearing only in the time of Cicero, who seems to have known the politics. Given changes in the political landscape that had taken place by then, the work received little attention, however, then falling along with the rest entirely out of view in the Latin West until Arabic scholars in Spain made Aristotle's works known once again. When scholars finally came to render or explain Aristotle's meaning in Latin, their efforts varied significantly according to their historical circumstances. And here, I would draw your attention to the lower part of the Aristotle text, where I have two translations of the last bit. Thus, in the 13th century, William of Moerbeke, whose translations form the basis for Aquinas' commentaries, rendered Aristotle's Greek as follows. But this is what is called a city and a political communication, communicatio politica. One thing that strikes the eye is its use of communicatio, where we might expect communitas, the abstract term corresponding to koinonia. These both mean community. This puzzle vanishes once we remember the prominence of koinonia in the New Testament, especially in the complex Pauline use, to refer both to the fellowship believers enjoy and to their participation through the Eucharist in the body and blood of Christ. In the Vulgate Bible of St. Jerome, koinonia is regularly rendered communicatio, namely that participatory fellowship from which one is barred if one is excommunicated. The second thing we notice is how Moerbeke is at a loss in translating politike, on which Jerome has given him no guidance, and so simply Latinizes the Greek term. 2 centuries later, the Florentine humanist Bruni had no such problem. As a native of 15th century Florence, he had no trouble imagining a polis. As far as he could see, he lived in one. He translated the phrase quite differently. But this is that which is called a city and a civil society, civilis societas. Instead of relying on ecclesiastical models, Bruni looked to classical precedents. The last phrase comes from Cicero and is the source from which we get our own phrase, civil society. Cicero's usual term for communities of men united under law is societas, a term with applications in various spheres of human cooperation. Thus, in Roman private law, a societas was made up of a fixed number of members, united under a contract and subject to certain conditions. Members were expected to contribute to a common goal, and an element of fraternity was assumed present to the group. The same terminology held of treaty-based alliances. Rome's allies throughout Italy were her socii, and when a number of these grew unhappy with terms they thought insufficiently equal, there was a protracted social war. Now that sounds like a lot of rival art openings and cocktail parties, but it was in fact Rome's conflict with her own restive allies. Common to all such uses of societas is the idea of some kind of agreement made for some definite common purpose. Which is not to say that the notion of agreement exhausts it. This recalls us to another dimension of the Greek terminology, in that koinon, the neuter form of the adjective related to koinonia, was used in reference to federal organizations of various kinds. 10 Ionian cities of Asia Minor had a koinon, headquartered in a religious sanctuary on Mount Micale. The Amphictyony at Delphi on the Greek mainland was of a similar character, and both played important roles in times of international stress. Greece successfully resisted incorporation in the Persian Empire by forming a Hellenic defensive alliance. What we call the Peloponnesian War took place between 2 subsequent alliances led by rival polis, Athens and Sparta, a pattern that continued into the 4th century between various other antagonists. In many ways, the political history of Greece during the classical era is a story about successive efforts to form effective alliances between a number of city-states, and some hard lessons learned in the process about the need for a measure of equality among the members of such alliances. Sometimes an underlying ethnic unity aided in establishing such alliances, so that as a tribal community began forming into polis, the older link would serve as a foundation of a resulting political alliance. Such alliances were prominent in post-classical times, when they partly determined the structure of Macedonian rule and of Greece as she eventually confronted Rome. These greater exercises in community formation were already a part of Aristotle's world, if not relevant to his analysis in the Politics, which remain within the orbit of the polis. Here, he forged another approach to the problems a Pythagorizing Plato had failed to address on the pragmatic plane by articulating a special kind of citizen characterized by virtue. Not virtue in its entirety, but a virtue of the kind suitable to a citizen and apt as an example for other men to follow. In short, a guiding principle of political leadership, preservative of political communities. It's no accident that members of Aristotle's school later on were active in the pragmatic realm, or that it was to such sources that writers of Roman times often looked for guidance. Excuse me a minute. A specific case relevant to the present topic is the developed Platonic Aristotelian theory of the mixed constitution that the Greek historian of Rome, Polybius, probably learned from a work by Dicaearchus. Greek political observers had distinguished three main kinds of politeia: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, each of which had its virtues, but also tended to degenerate into a correspondingly vicious form: tyranny, oligarchy, and achlocracy. And achlos is a mob. To the point at which dissatisfaction of one group or another of partisans brought about a revolutionary alteration, resulting in that group's favored form. This process would move forward, eventually returning to its starting point, so that mankind seemed doomed to an endless cycle of political disturbances. A solution to this prospect was articulated in the idea of a constitution that combined elements representing each of these three principles. The constitution that, so to speak, mixed monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements together. The idea was that as one part began to degenerate in legitimacy, another could check its tendencies, resulting in a state of affairs in which three opposing principles tended to offset one another, allowing for an escape of the usual cycle of degenerations followed by revolutions. Polybius saw in this theory the Greek to understanding Rome's remarkable success as of 146 before Christ, viewing it as a polis whose politeia was of just such a character, with the magistrates as the monarchical element, the Senate as the aristocratic one, and the popular assembly as the democratic one. He speaks of a balance or equilibrium between these factors, and notes that Rome overcame a degenerate Carthage in which the Senate had become weak and the democratic element too strong. Almost a century after Polybius, when Cicero came to write a book, De Republica, on the Republic or Commonwealth, a work he explicitly modeled on Plato's Politeia, circumstances had changed. Rome had entered a period characterized by internal political conflicts that would eventually lead to a civil war, whose victor became the first emperor. To give you some flavor, in 63 before Christ, about a decade before he was writing this work, Cicero, who that year was one of the two highest magistrates in Rome, also defended an ostensibly victorious consular candidate for the following year, named Murena, against allegations of election fraud, and then had to put down a conspiracy and armed rebellion launched by partisans of a losing candidate named Catiline. In 58, political fallout from these events resulted in Cicero's temporary exile on the motion of a tribune named Clodius, who developed to an art of sorts the pursuit of political ends via the use of outright force. For a time, gangs of thugs under his direction terrorized downtown Rome. Their methods included accosting and beating Clodius' opponents in the streets, jeering them loudly in public, pelting them with filth at the games, besieging their homes by throwing rocks and other projectiles, and even attempting to set these on fire. If any of this sounds eerily familiar, it's because history tends to repeat itself. Well, things came to a head in 52 before Christ when Clodius and some partisans met with a friend of Cicero named Milo and his supporters on the Appian Way. A rumble ensued in which Clodius was killed. Milo was charged, and Cicero took up his legal defense, in which he argued that the situation had been one of uncontrolled mob violence, leaving Milo no choice. It was in the midst of these very circumstances that Cicero was writing his work on the Republic, in which he adapted Polybius' views about Rome, except that he now sought out the ideal in Rome's past, perhaps following Plato's example in his Timaeus and Critias. He did not urge a return to the old ways as a remedy. Instead, he combined Plato's idea of a combination of power with wisdom, Aristotle's idea of the exemplary man of citizen virtue, and also perhaps the orator-philosopher Isocrates' teaching that the good man is the same as the accomplished speaker, from which he distilled a theory of responsible political governance in the person of the Rector Republicae, the pilot of the Republic. He had articulated the humanistic dimension of this ideal a few years previous in a work entitled On the Orator, and now presented it once again in the context of an explicitly political teaching. It is unfortunate that the later books of the work containing this treatment have been almost entirely lost. In commencing the earlier discussion, Cicero has his character Scipio Africanus, the exemplary Roman who, under Polybius' watchful gaze, had reduced Carthage, define its subject matter. And here we want to see the Cicero text, which I will read. So then, a republic is a thing of a people. A people, however, is not every assemblage of human beings herded together in whatever way, but an assemblage of a multitude united in agreement about right and in the sharing of advantage. I'll read it again. So then a republic is a thing of the people, a thing of a people. A people, however, is not every assemblage of human beings herded together in whatever way, but an assemblage of a multitude united in agreement about right and in the sharing of advantage. I've tried to indicate the meanings of some of these terms below the text. For a mere assemblage of persons to become a res publica, a republic, requires that they associate, and in two regards: an agreement about right or justice, and a communion relative to needs. As if to offset a misunderstanding of the second criterion, Scipio is quick to add that such an association arises less from weakness than from a natural human tendency to congregate, thereby distancing his view from theories deriving politics from hypothetically brutish states of nature, which you can find in somebody like Lucretius, for instance. The two criteria for a populace are stated in very compact terms, subject to competing interpretations into which I cannot enter here. I'll say something general about their immediate relevance, however. Scipio lays out Cicero's version of the theory of a balanced constitution next, which he in the second book then describes as coming into being with a sketch of Roman history, beginning with Romulus. He ends that history with a Platonic image of a harmonious attunement of differing parts, which in Cicero's writings takes the form of a concord of the orders, or a concord of all good men. In what Scipio says about the causes of disorder that lead single kinds of regime to deteriorate, we see that the degenerate forms, in one way or another, all fall short in respect of an agreement about justice. Thus, ochlocracy, which is to say mob rule, is a democracy now animated by a principle of violence rather than one of right. The loss of this agreement then impairs any sharing in utility. In principle, a regime could fail of either of the criteria while satisfying the other, but Cicero seems to think that in practice at least, a deficiency in one means a deficiency in the other as well. So a multitude under a tyranny, oligarchy, or ochlocracy is not, properly speaking, a populace at all, but an assemblage of men subject to one faction or another. Now, Cicero's definition of populace and the consequent understanding of a republic has had an important life in the subsequent tradition, but for a long time it had to do so without the benefit of its literary context. Since the work was lost to view sometime during the 7th century, to reemerge only in the early 19th, when a palimpsest manuscript of it was discovered in the Vatican. But the work had been available to St. Augustine, who used it as foil in his City of God, from which later generations could infer its main outlines and also see this passage reproduced. Augustine's criticism of it as insufficient, on the grounds that Rome had been unjust and that the only republic worthy of the name was the one over which God was sovereign, dominated understandings of a republic through the end of the Middle Ages, when, among other factors, the rediscovery and study of Aristotle's Politics placed matters in a new light. By the end of the 15th century, several competing understandings of a republic were in play. Early modern political thinkers came to grips with the situation by bringing Cicero's own understanding to bear once again, tending to define a republic by its balanced constitution or the requirements of popular consent and political participation, or both. In the 17th century, the model of an ecumenical Christian populace was fast receding before these ideas. And by the 18th, the ancient understanding of a republic could serve the American founders as a model by its modern version in the writings of Montesquieu. It is on the basis of this model, ultimately, that we, the people, live under a constitution tempered by checks and balances between different elements, and all with a view to certain stated common goals. Having arrived at the American Republic, I should mention that there are, broadly speaking, two opposed schools of thought about its relation to classical political practice and thought. According to one, the founders, being steeped in a classical education, naturally enough applied what they had learned in forming their ideas about republican government. Proponents of this view point to numerous appeals to ancient historical events or theoretical statements the founders make in their writings. An opposing view claims that such appeals are merely rhetorically decorative in character and not determinative of the founders' own thought. We read the phrase window dressing, arguments that modern thinkers like Locke were the real influences on their political thinking. There are various ways in which to mediate this disagreement. One might, for instance, try to turn Locke into an Aristotelian of some kind. One need not, however, go to such lengths in order to observe two things. First, to be influenced by certain moderns is in fact to be influenced indirectly by ancient political thought. Montesquieu didn't come to speak of a mixed constitution by studying British political history. At the same time, it seems myopic to gather scattered references to the classics in the founders' writings, laying aside their extensive discussion of modern events and writers, and then conclude from this that one has laid bare the sources of their thought. They were by and large practical men, and so drew what they thought most useful from various sources, a practice in which Cicero served them as a model. And these included historical events and political thinking, both modern and ancient. Perhaps the right way in which to view the ancient is as a critical argumentative component of the persuasive case they had to make to their contemporaries on behalf of a novel kind of republic. Politics does not proceed by theory alone, and thought itself is guided partly by persuasion. I'll close by illustrating this general claim with reference to the particular case of John Adams, surely one of the better educated of the founders. The second US president, like the Roman consul Cicero, was first a professional advocate. His best known case occurred when he was asked to represent the British troops who fired on a crowd in 1770, an event his second cousin Samuel sensationally styled the Boston Massacre, a rubric that has stuck. What is recorded of his defense of the common soldiers participating in the event shows signs of his having used Cicero's defense of Milo as a model. What he calls the motley crowd the soldiers confronted was in effect a rioting mob, leaving them little choice but to respond as they did. Adams had studied Cicero's speeches and learned from them. But his reliance on classical precedents extended beyond his properly forensic work into his political writings. At the time of the War for Independence, the use of the term republic in Europe was by no means univocal. When in 1778, the Frenchman Turgot wrote a letter criticizing the constitutions of the American colonies, then in revolt, on the grounds that they were insufficiently Republican in respect of a principle of equality of the citizens, Adams was moved to reply in a lengthy defense of these same constitutions, in which he set out several points familiar to any American educated in civics now, but less than natural to many even sympathetic thinkers of his own day. We can see him explaining the basics of a system of checks and balances with reference to ancient precedents of mixed constitutions, both factual and theoretical. It's a bit like trying to explain the Electoral College today to someone who supposes that presidential election outcomes failing to reflect the overall popular vote are somehow wrong. It isn't a bug, it's a feature. This is but one example from an ambitious literary work, which was not without its theoretical influence. Yet John Adams, like the other founders, was still a practical man at heart. He once undertook to appreciate Plato's writings, reading through all of them, but foundering in the attempt, as he admits in a letter to a like-minded Thomas Jefferson. Noticeable in his confession, however, is an intuition that Plato must have intended his republic with its unconventional guardian community in some satirical way, since, and here I will quote his own words, nothing could be conceived more destructive of human happiness, more infallibly contrived to transform men and women into brutes, yahoos, or demons than a community of wives and property. And it's with that provocative thought that I'll conclude my talk for today. Are there any comments or questions?
Terrific, Professor Auslin. Thank you very much. We'll open it up to questions from the audience. And while we're waiting for people to figure out how to do that, I will start with a question. We've seen a lot of, and you referenced it several times in your talk, a lot of modern groupings of people that don't seem to be aimed at virtue, but rather tearing down the established institutions, groups of anarchists, what have you. Do even they, such communities, aim at some good? As Aristotle says, all communities aim at some good, or is there something different afoot in your mind?
Well, to the extent to which Aristotle is ultimately a Socratic, he would have to say that nobody does anything wrong willingly, and it's because everyone somehow conceives an advantage in a course of action he's undertaking. And that is, in fact, the parenthetical premise in that opening bit that I read from him. People aim at what they conceive to be a good. Now, the problem that both Aristotle and Cicero, following Plato, try to address is the problem that arises from exceedingly partisan understandings of what's good as being what's good for everyone. And it seems like the tradition settles into this idea of balance and equilibrium. So I'm not sure what Aristotle would say about such a group. I can tell you what Cicero says about Clodius and his people. He doesn't like them. But the idea would be to have institutions arranged in such a way that there was some sort of escape valve for that kind of passion. And that's why it's important with the civitas, which in some sense is like the res publica, but in some sense different in that it represents all the various institutions. It's why it's so important with the civitas to have some sort of principles of order. I mean, the pragmatic expression of this agreement about right is law. And you need to resort to that in order to come to grips with what you're talking about. I think it's fair to say that Aristotle and Cicero would agree that one has to maintain the law. I'm not sure this is exactly addressing your point. I'm trying to avoid evaluating anyone in particular right now. I'm just the classicist explaining these out-of-date thinkers. Is that
okay,
sufficient?
Ellen. Go ahead.
Is that sufficient?
Yeah, that was good. So let me tie while we're waiting, and I encourage anybody in the audience to weigh in with questions.
Yeah, you kind of froze up there.
While we're waiting with, if there was a question just sent to me, my chat box closed, and so you could resend it. But it seems somehow what we're experiencing now may be tied a bit to the loss of the idea of separation of powers or a mixed regime. We have legislatures that rarely, if ever, legislate anymore. A lot goes on now through the executive or even through the judiciary, which kind of bottles up outlets for Republican response to the political problems of the day. Cicero and Aristotle both thought the idea of a mixed regime was critical. Do you see any connection between our watering down of our separation of powers and some of the more recent rather divisive and explosive actions?
Well, yes, and in trying to apply the idea of a mixed constitution to the U.S., I mean, there's problems in this. It's a complex matter. Some people speak of the U.S. being a mixed democracy. In Aristotelian terms, that makes no sense. Democracy is one principle of three, and you can't mix a principle with itself. So I follow the minority school of thought that says that that doesn't make sense. But my remark on the Electoral College was meant to address that in a way. The Electoral College is an expression of the attempt to mitigate a democratic principle in some degree in favor of an aristocratic one. To criticize the Electoral College is in effect to say there shouldn't be two houses in the legislature, get rid of the Senate, which, by the way, was exactly the position Turgot took. Have a unicameral legislature. It's a lot more democratic. And so when we hear calls to get rid of the Electoral College because it's unfair, this clearly represents an effort to do away, whether consciously or not, an effort to do away with what is in effect one of these checks. So that's one way in which to look at a lot of this stuff. But another way in which to look at it is just lawless violence.
We've got a very good question, but before I turn to that, I want to ask one follow-up here. Contemporary political rhetoric seems to track the old degeneration of regimes. We talk about the 1%. We talk about various demands of equal distribution of wealth, of housing, of education access, healthcare for all. These seem to be pitting the propertied against the less propertied, the same type of degenerative cycle of regime change that Aristotle criticized that led to the mixed regime. Am I right in thinking that there's some feature of what's going on that they had raised to express such concerns about?
Well, the urge for greater equality, and in particular for equal distribution, Cicero quite clearly regards as something proper to pure democracy. And in fact, what he's considering these three single constitutions, each of them has its good points and it has its bad points. And the bad point for democracy is clearly that it doesn't take account of relevant differences. It doesn't, to put it in Aristotelian terms, take account of the principle of proportional equality and elevates above it the idea of an arithmetic principle of equality. The Cicero would have no problem analyzing these phenomena, and neither would Aristotle. In fact, that particular schema can be traced to Pythagorean thought, as most of these mathematical moves can.
Got it. So here's a good question come in. Consent is a prominent feature of our current political participation. Is there any suggestion of consent in some of the early thinkers or a concept similar to consent?
Well, if you look at that Ciceronian passage, you will notice his term, agreement, is consensu. It's in the ablative there. The regular form is consensus. And agreement about right, juris consensu. Now, there's a danger of looking at that and saying, oh, well, what we have here is something fundamentally contractual, and moving away from the idea that it has a natural basis. And Cicero is careful to head off that sort of way of looking at it, I think. But from a certain standpoint, Cicero's framing of his definition of a republic through a definition of a populace departs a bit from the Aristotelian understanding of a political community, in that Aristotle talks about the political community almost as if it's another one of his naturally growing things. I mean, the idea of an agreement is not key to it. It does come up in Cicero's definition, and I tried to give some background about the idea of societas and that whole notion of a partnership and so forth. So one might be tempted to say, oh, well, the Roman view here is introducing the idea of agreement on top of a more natural, organic Greek view. But the fact is that Plato's already taken care of that in Book 1 of the Republic by starting out by talking about what are called koinonemata, instances of partnerships. His interlocutor is Polemarchus at that point. This is very early in the Republic. And they're talking about what they call symbolia, which is the Greek word for transactions. And Socrates says, so what do you mean by that, koinonemata? And Polemarchus says, yeah, koinonemata. And so then the problem becomes, well, what qualifies somebody as a good koinonos, somebody with whom to form a partnership? And they're often running to talk about justice, you see. So they take their beginning in the Republic too, well before Aristotle, in the idea of a transaction, but it is immediately discussed in terms of the idea of a partnership. There's no sign of it arising out of fear of violent death or anything like that. So I think in some sense, consent is present from the outset, insofar as you need to have a meeting of minds for a contract, right? But it becomes quite explicit in the Roman case, and I'm sure it's because of Cicero's involvement with the law to some extent. Is that at all apposite to the question?
I think very much so. We're now getting a slew of questions, so let me take them in turn. The first starts off with a nice note of gratitude. Thank you very much, Professor Osland. Talks of depth such as these are amazing. You think studying the classics leads to meaningful praxis in our republic today?
Oh, sure. And it can lead to sanity as well. You know, when I mention that history repeats itself, I try to tell this to my friends that work themselves into a real worry every 4 years, that this coming election is going to be the end of the world unless it goes a certain way. Now, we all have political preferences, but believe me, if you want to cure yourself of that anxiety, read some Roman and Greek history. It's all happened before, and it goes on, and it will continue to go on and on. And if you really want to relax, read some Homer.
Okay.
So yeah, I very much recommend the study of the classics. I think it gives one a certain amount of distance. The main colleagues at the university I found I had something in common with. At parties, you know, generalized faculty parties, were the astronomers. They thought about what's going to happen 3 billion years from now. And they really take the long view. Studying the classics helps you do it with politics, big time. Whether it will equip you to go out and fight it out with the likes of Claudius, you might pick up some tips. I guess John Adams did.
Indeed. You mentioned as harmony or concordia in processing of difference and dissent within the political community. Which would be some classical or ancient views to process such conflicts without the dissolution of the community itself? In other words, was the mixed regime, the mixed constitution enough?
Well, regime is just an alternative translation used by a number of people for politeia, which quite often is translated constitution. The trouble is that politeia doesn't translate very well into any single English expression, or for that matter, any Latin expression. And it means something, the principle by which the life of the polis takes place, the organized principle, but it can also refer to citizenship. In some sense, it's immanent in the persons that make up the polis. So it's a difficult notion to grasp. But I've lost track of the question. You need to reframe it.
So what in the discussion of harmony or concordia in the ancients might we rely on to try and deal with conflicts in our own community without the dissolution of the community itself?
Well, insofar as it's an expression of this idea of the mixed regime, it's a bit utopian, really. The extent to which one can talk about real constitutional arrangements as mixed regimes in the ancient sense is perhaps limited, but it helps you come to grips with certain conflicts you see at work. You know, it's in its original articulation, if I'm right about this, it took the form of a mathematical theory of proportions the Pythagoreans applied to politics. And the idea being that if you applied arithmetic and geometric and also harmonic equality, you would get a super proportion of proportions themselves, that was expressive of the ideal political order. Well, this is the kind of thing that's pretty hard to put into practice. But it's a framework within which to understand what you see. I suppose, as a practical matter, trying to bring about harmony means acting to preserve the extent to which this set of principles is at work. And it is present in our constitutional arrangements. So to some extent, it comes down to seeing why defending the Constitution represents keeping that idea alive. I mean, that's a very general way of putting it. I'm not in a position to make practical solutions for solving the problems of the current community. But it does help, I think, to have terms within which to conceive it other than friends and enemies. You see what I mean? I hope that's sufficient.
No, that's very good. And it's a nice segue into our future lectures. I'll be speaking in October about the universal principles applied in a particular context that are reflected in our Constitution. We have Lucas Morel joining us later in October, talking about the missed opportunity of the 1619 Project. And then our other senior scholar in conservative thought here at the Benson Center, Elizabeth Siedebakke Eastman, in November, talking about the role of liberal education in addressing these questions. We're running toward the end of our time. Let me ask another question here. You talked about a couple of points where the Greek city-state or became more, the idea of political community became more universal. Certainly the advent of Christianity and the Constantinian Revolution in Rome, the alliance of Christian and Roman regimes. The same type of thing takes place a bit in medieval Islamist thought. And it may be taking place again with the idea of kind of global citizen or universality, even questioning the notion of sovereignty and nation state. Does that make it grander, a political community in scale, or does it make it impossible to have political communities that can address these kind of questions?
Well, there was a part I left out reading this in the interest of time that to some extent addresses that. I think in brief, I would say that there are two opposing currents at work in the kind of phenomenon you're describing. When the Romans conquered Greece, to put it in the terms that Horace did, Greece conquered the Romans culturally. And the Romans became a cultivated society because of their absorption of Greek culture. The Latin language was a very crude instrument for discussing any of these things before Cicero and Caesar and people like that got their hands on it. They did quite a good job. And, but still, a sign of the influence of Greece, the fact is that a large part of the Roman world was effectively a Greek world because they took it from Macedon. That's why the New Testament was written in Greek. And a lot of historians of Rome, later than Polybius, wrote in Greek. And they had problems expressing Roman political institutions, and you can't really translate res publica into Greek. In the Res Gestae of Augustus, which was translated into Greek for its promulgation, the phrase is translated 4 different ways. And when they wanted to discuss the Roman Empire, there wasn't any clear Greek terminology for it. And to make a long story short, eventually the tendency among Greek writers describing the success of Rome and the Roman Empire was to describe it as a huge polis. And the empire was just the dependent territory. I mean, that's how they conceived it. At the same time, you have the influence of Christianity modifying this, because there's this ecumenical strain, to say the least. And especially as a result of the sort of thing that St. Paul had to say, And through Augustine's treatment in the City of God, you ended up with the idea that the only real republic was the church. And these things were in some tension with each other between Christian and secular writers throughout the end of antiquity. From an Aristotelian perspective, probably he would say that's impossible. He clearly views, as you can see from that passage I quoted, the polis as the most comprehensive political community. But there were plenty of people who thought they could extend that. Well, I see we're running out of time. Let me just make one suggestion. If you want to take a crack at reading some classics that might be practical here and now, I wouldn't fool with De Republica, Cicero initially. Try On the Orator. It's in 3 books, good work. Might be worth looking at. So I'll close with that idea.
Very good. And thank you very much for a very insightful and thought-provoking lecture. We're going to re-air this tonight at 6 p.m. For those that weren't able to attend in the live format this morning. And then the next lecture in the series on community and disunity will be mine on the Constitution, on a thought-provoking lecture. We're going to re-air this tonight. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome now to the live portion of our replay of Hayden Osland's lecture this morning. The time differential between here and Norway necessitated us going on earlier in the day. And you saw a good number of questions that we were able to pose directly to Hayden. But we wanted to open it up for questions for the replays. I have a live segment or component for the evening performance as well. And joining me for that is my wife and one of the other senior scholars at the Benson Center this year with me, Elizabeth Siedebakke-Eastman. Elizabeth, welcome.
Well, thank you.
I thought we would start off by putting this foundational lecture in context of the broader theme for the lecture series on community and disunity. So you can take that away, Elizabeth.
Yeah, every year the Benson Center advances a theme, and part of our duties is to assemble lecturers, speakers from around the country and happily from around the world, including Scandinavian countries, and just invite thoughtful people to share their thoughts through a lecture, and then to invite questions from listeners, participants, and such. They will be available later at the Benson Center website. And so if you want students to listen or want to share the content with others, please encourage them to go visit and listen to the lectures. We have a number of folks scheduled as well, upcoming events. We opted to only schedule the fall lectures. We held off on inviting folks for the spring, hoping that just maybe the campus would open, but no definitive word, but it looks like we may be continuing the Zoom series in the spring. Doesn't matter. We still get really very thoughtful people who are wanting to join us. And I just want to say a word or two about this theme, community or disunity. And it's an apt theme precisely because, well, in an election year, we're divided. We're divided among party lines. And the question is once the election is over, regardless of who wins, are we able to come back as members of a community and engage once again in civil dialogue, and as well, try to begin to persuade in anticipation of subsequent lectures. Excuse me, not subsequent lectures, subsequent elections. Some of the questions that we're going to be visiting are, what is community? How and can community be built? What causes communities to fall apart? And is it possible for communities, local, national, international, even virtual communities, to maintain cohesion and avoid disunity? And then as well, how can we as individuals, we have various connections. We have social, political, geographical, virtual. In what ways can we facilitate the commonalities, but as well respect the differences that we articulate amongst ourselves? All of these things make for very rich dialogue. And I think first and foremost, we have to recall that we listen, we engage, we debate, and maybe at the end of the day, we agree to disagree, but nonetheless, recalling always that we are members of a community and we're the better for it. We're the richer for it.
One of the things that struck me most about Hayden's lecture is how germane it seems to be in the issues that we're confronting today as a nation. I remember when I was in graduate school, I had an old history professor. When it was asked why he studies history, he says, because it can tell us a nice story. But he didn't think it was any more than that. I think what Hayden's lecture gave us today is much more than a nice story, that there are rather eternal issues in human nature that keep coming back to the forefront in different communities, in different regions of the world at different times and eras. But they're all tapping into the same internal conflicts in human nature. So there's much we can learn from the study of history, from the study of Greek and Roman political thought, for example, as Hayden's set out. And that's why we asked him to give the opening lecture in this series. Really remind us that nothing's new under the sun. There are a lot of opportunities to learn from great thinkers and great events, even great tragedies of the past, so that we can avoid the pitfalls and maybe even get better at grappling with the consequences of human nature as it comes together in community. So I think it was a terrific start to the lecture. We're here to open to have any questions that you might have by typing into the chat box at the YouTube live stream or sending an email to the Benson Center. I don't know. Maybe somebody can post into the chat what the email would be if you have any questions. But that was, we wanted to give you an opportunity. We don't purport to be able to speak on Hayden's behalf. If you have questions for him, we'll funnel them to them offline. But maybe we can engage in some comment or discussion about some of the themes he's raised if you're so inclined.
The subsequent lectures will be live beginning at 6 p.m. If you go to the Benson Center website, you'll see the list of events. We have scheduled 3 more lectures for the fall. And in addition to that, the Benson Center is inviting other speakers. They'll all be Zoom presentations. So I encourage you to check them out, share the information with your friends and students, and engage in the debate.
Okay. Well, it's been wonderful. I hope you enjoyed Hayden's lecture and the Q&A after it. And with that, unless somebody wants to raise their hand quickly, I think we'll call it a night and look forward to seeing you at the next Benson lecture and the Community and Disunity theme series, which will be my own talk on October 6th on the Constitution of the United States, a particular founding on universal principles.